There's something people don't understand about empaths, and that misunderstanding is exactly why they get betrayed, used, and underestimated. You don't lie to an empath the way you lie to other people, because when you lie to most people, you're dealing with words. But when you lie to an empath, you're dealing with perception. And perception is something they don't just hear, they feel. Let that sink in. An empath doesn't just listen to what you say, they absorb the energy behind it. The pauses, the micro changes in tone, the inconsistency between your words and your intention, even the emotion you try to hide inside your own nervous system. And here's the part that shocks most people. They may not call you out immediately, but they already know, long before you think they do. Most people assume deception works because it sounds convincing. But with an empath, you are not just speaking into their ears, you are speaking into their awareness. An empath does not experience communication the way most people assume communication works. For most individuals, language is a structured exchange of words, logic, and meaning. But for an empath, words are only the surface layer of something far deeper and more complex. Beneath every sentence there is tone. Beneath every tone there is emotional intention. Beneath every intention there is energy. And an empath is constantly reading all of it at the same time without consciously trying to separate it. This is not imagination. It is perception operating on multiple channels simultaneously, where spoken language becomes only a fraction of the full signal being received. When someone lies, they usually focus on controlling the words. They rehearse sentences. They adjust vocabulary. They build a version of reality that sounds acceptable, even convincing. But what they fail to control is everything underneath the words. The nervous system does not fully obey deception. Subtle tension appears in the voice. Breathing patterns shift slightly. Eye movement becomes less natural. Timing between phrases changes. Emotional consistency breaks in small fragments. Most people never notice these details because they are trained to listen only to content. An empath listens to content, but also to contradiction. And contradiction is always present when truth and expression are not aligned. This is why an empath can sit in a conversation that appears normal on the surface, while internally experiencing a completely different version of it. They are not guessing. They are tracking. The human system is constantly broadcasting emotional data, whether a person is aware of it or not. Stress creates compression in speech. Guilt creates hesitation. Fear creates over-explanation. Dishonesty creates subtle dissonance between what is said and what is felt. An empath does not need a confession to detect this. The body already confessed before the mind finished constructing the lie. What makes this even more intense is that empaths are not just passive receivers. Their perception is comparative. They unconsciously compare what they are sensing in real time with what they have previously learned about the person's emotional baseline. Every human has a pattern of emotional consistency, even if they are not aware of it. The way someone normally laughs, pauses, reacts, or shifts tone becomes a reference point. When a lie is introduced into that system, it disrupts consistency, and disruption is instantly recognizable at an intuitive level. Most people assume that if a lie is delivered calmly, it will pass unnoticed. But calmness itself can become a signal. Over-control of emotion can feel unnatural when it does not match the situation. Too much precision in wording can feel rehearsed. Too little emotional engagement can feel detached. Too much emotional display can feel forced. There is a narrow band of natural behavior, and deception often pushes a person outside of that band without them realizing it. An empath does not need to consciously analyze this. It registers automatically, like background processing that never turns off. Another layer that is rarely understood is that empaths are highly sensitive to incongruence between verbal and nonverbal communication. A person may say something confident while their body language communicates hesitation. They may express honesty while their micro-expressions reveal discomfort. They may attempt sincerity while their timing feels delayed, as if emotion is being applied after thought rather than arising naturally. These mismatches are not dramatic, they are subtle. But subtle patterns repeated across seconds of interaction create a clear internal signal that something is misaligned. Over time, empaths develop what can be described as emotional pattern memory. This is not memory in the traditional sense of recalling facts, but memory of how people feel when they are aligned versus when they are not. It becomes a reference system that operates beneath conscious thought. When something feels off, it is not vague intuition. It is the recognition of deviation from an established emotional model. That model is built from thousands of micro-observations that accumulate quietly during interaction. This is why deception does not remain hidden for long. Even if the lie is successful in the moment, it does not erase the sensory data collected during its delivery. Every interaction becomes a recorded emotional signature. The empath may continue the conversation normally, but internally, the system has already marked inconsistency. That mark does not fade quickly, because it is tied not just to words, but to the felt experience of those words being spoken. There is also a deeper psychological layer at play. Empaths are often naturally oriented toward understanding rather than confrontation. This means that when they detect inconsistency, their first instinct is not accusation, but interpretation. They try to understand why the mismatch exists. They consider emotional state, stress, fear, insecurity, or external pressure. This creates a delay between detection and response, which is often misinterpreted by others as lack of awareness. In reality, awareness is fully active, but processing is still unfolding internally. During this phase, observation becomes sharper. The empath begins to unconsciously test consistency over time. They compare future statements with previous ones. They notice whether emotional tone stabilizes or continues to fluctuate. They track whether behavior aligns with declared intent across different situations. This is not done in a structured or deliberate way. It happens naturally as attention begins to focus more intensely on coherence. What many do not realize is that once this shift in perception begins, it is difficult to reverse. Because the empath is no longer experiencing interaction at face value, they are experiencing it as layered information. The spoken message becomes secondary to the emotional structure supporting it. Even genuine words begin to lose impact if they are surrounded by inconsistency. Trust is no longer built on promises, but on alignment over time. And in this state, every new interaction either restores coherence or deepens suspicion. There is no neutral ground. Each moment either reinforces stability or adds another layer of doubt. This accumulation is quiet but powerful. It does not explode in confrontation immediately. It builds internally until the emotional model of the person being observed no longer matches the version they present outwardly. That divergence is what ultimately reshapes the entire perception, and once reshaped, it does not simply revert back to previous understanding. Most people misunderstand what silence means in a person who is highly perceptive. They assume silence is emptiness, lack of awareness, or emotional passivity. But when you are dealing with an empath, silence is rarely empty. It is active, it is structured, it is processing, and most importantly, it is observant. When an empath does not immediately react to inconsistency, deception, or emotional misalignment, it is not because they failed to notice. It is because their internal system does not prioritize reaction over understanding. They do not rush to conclusions because their perception is not built on impulse, but on pattern confirmation over time. In normal interaction, people often assume that detection and reaction happen together. If someone lies, the expectation is immediate confrontation or visible emotional response. But an empath does not operate on that linear model. When they detect something off, their first instinct is not exposure, it is examination. They begin to silently map what they are experiencing against what they already know about the person. This mapping process is not verbal, it is experiential. It is like a background system continuously comparing data points across time, tone, behavior, and emotional consistency. During this stage, the empath appears calm, sometimes even unaffected. This is where most people misjudge the situation. They interpret calmness as acceptance. They interpret lack of confrontation as ignorance. But internally, something very different is happening. The empath is not reacting outwardly because all available energy is being redirected inward toward analysis. Every word that was spoken is being replayed in context. Every emotional signal is being compared with prior behavior. Every inconsistency is being stored, not dismissed. This creates a false sense of security for the person who is being observed. They believe they have successfully bypassed detection because there is no visible consequence. No argument, no emotional escalation, no immediate rejection. This reinforces their assumption that the lie or manipulation has been accepted. But what they do not realize is that acceptance and silence are not the same thing in an empath. Silence is often the beginning of deeper scrutiny, not the absence of it. As time continues, the empath's internal focus shifts from isolated incidents to patterns. One inconsistency alone may not be enough to define character, but repeated patterns begin to form a psychological structure. The empath starts to notice timing differences, emotional inconsistencies, and behavioral mismatches across multiple interactions. They begin to unconsciously predict responses before they happen, and when reality deviates from that internal prediction, attention sharpens even further. This is where the observation becomes more precise. The empath is no longer just receiving information. They are testing it internally. They are measuring whether future behavior aligns with past behavior. They are not asking questions out loud, but they are constantly asking questions internally. Does this reaction match the emotional context? Does this explanation align with previous statements? Does this tone reflect genuine intent or constructed narrative? What makes this process so powerful is that it is cumulative. Each new interaction does not exist in isolation. It adds to an existing internal database of emotional evidence. Over time, the empath builds a layered understanding of the person that goes beyond what is explicitly said. They begin to understand tendencies, not just statements. They begin to see direction, not just isolated behavior. And once direction becomes clear, interpretation changes permanently. During this entire phase, the empath may still engage normally. They may still respond, still listen, still appear open. This continuation of normal interaction is often mistaken as emotional stability or lack of awareness. But in reality, it is controlled observation. The empath is not emotionally absent. They are emotionally restrained while they gather clarity. They are waiting for consistency to either validate trust or eliminate it. This is also where most people underestimate the emotional intelligence involved. Because while deception often relies on controlling what is said, it rarely accounts for what is felt. The empath is reading both simultaneously. Even when words are perfectly structured, emotional undertones can reveal hesitation, discomfort, or internal conflict. These subtle signals accumulate over time and begin to form a more accurate picture than words alone could ever provide. At a deeper level, the empath is also monitoring change. They are sensitive not just to what someone is, but how someone shifts under different conditions. Stress, pressure, emotional triggers, and situational discomfort all reveal variations in behavior. These variations are not judged immediately, but they are noted. And when variations consistently align with certain contexts, they begin to form behavioral expectations. What makes this stage particularly significant is that trust is no longer based on declaration. It is based on consistency under observation. The empath begins to rely less on what is promised and more on what is demonstrated repeatedly over time. This shift is subtle but irreversible. Once perception moves from emotional engagement to analytical observation, the relationship dynamic changes fundamentally. The most misunderstood part of this entire process is that the empath does not feel the need to rush clarity. There is no urgency to confront immediately because clarity is not dependent on confrontation. It is dependent on accumulation, and accumulation requires time. So instead of reacting, they wait. Not passively, but strategically. They allow behavior to continue so that the full pattern can reveal itself without interruption. During this waiting phase, emotional distance begins to form internally. Not outwardly, not yet, but internally. The empath starts to separate emotional response from emotional investment. They still care in a human sense, but they begin to detach from automatic trust. Every interaction becomes filtered through awareness rather than assumption. This does not happen consciously. It develops as a natural consequence of repeated inconsistency. As this internal separation grows, the empath becomes less emotionally reactive to things that would normally trigger response. Not because they are unaffected, but because their internal system is prioritizing understanding over reaction. This is where silence deepens, not as ignorance, but as controlled processing. The empath is no longer emotionally participating in the same way. They are observing participation itself. And while the outside world sees calmness, what is actually happening is recalibration. The empath is continuously adjusting their internal model of who the person is based on new data. Each piece of behavior either strengthens the model or destabilizes it. And once destabilization becomes dominant, emotional investment naturally begins to withdraw without dramatic confrontation. When trust breaks in an empath, it does not collapse in the way most people expect. There is no sudden emotional explosion, no dramatic confrontation that signals the end in a loud, obvious way. What actually happens is far more subtle and far more irreversible. It is not the breaking of a relationship that defines the shift. It is the completion of an internal conclusion. And once that conclusion is reached, everything externally still happening becomes secondary to what is already finished internally. An empath does not arrive at detachment randomly. It is built through accumulation. Every inconsistency, every emotional mismatch, every moment of deception or misalignment is not discarded. It is stored. At first, these moments seem small, almost insignificant on their own. But over time, they begin to form a pattern that the mind cannot ignore. And when a pattern becomes undeniable, perception begins to reorganize itself around it. This reorganization is quiet, but it is absolute. What makes this stage so difficult to recognize from the outside is that empaths often maintain outward normalcy long after internal trust has already collapsed. They can still communicate, still respond, still engage in conversation, but the emotional foundation that once made those interactions meaningful has already shifted. The emotional weight is gone, even if the physical presence remains. This is why people often misread the situation completely. They assume everything is still intact because nothing dramatic has changed externally, but internally, the structure has already been dismantled. At this point, the empath no longer experiences the person through hope or emotional expectation. They experience them through established understanding. And understanding does not require emotional investment. It only requires clarity. Once clarity replaces uncertainty, the need for emotional validation disappears. They are no longer looking for reassurance, explanation, or change. They have already completed the process of internal evaluation. This is where silence takes on a different meaning. Earlier, silence was observation. Now silence becomes separation. It is no longer about collecting data or waiting for confirmation. It is about conserving emotional energy. The empath no longer invests emotional presence into interactions that have already been internally resolved. They may still respond out of respect or habit, but the emotional connection that once fueled engagement is no longer active. What most people fail to understand is that empaths do not detach impulsively. They detach structurally. It is not based on a single moment of pain or disappointment. It is based on a cumulative shift in perception that reaches a final threshold. Once that threshold is crossed, the internal system no longer seeks to repair the relationship because repair implies that something is still intact. In the empath's perception, the structure is no longer intact. It has already been evaluated, categorized, and concluded. At this stage, emotional reactions from the other person lose influence. Apologies, explanations, or attempts to reestablish trust no longer carry the same weight. Not because the empath is being cold or unforgiving in a simple emotional sense, but because the internal model has already stabilized. And once a model stabilizes, new input no longer reshapes it easily. The empath has already accounted for the patterns that led to breakdown. Additional emotional input is processed as repetition, not transformation. This is where the most painful realization occurs for the other person. They often expect that emotional intensity can reverse the outcome. They believe that if they express enough regret, enough sincerity, or enough urgency, the empath will return to a previous emotional state. But what they do not understand is that the empath is no longer operating in that previous state. The emotional system that once responded to connection has already shifted into analysis and closure. Once closure happens internally, the empath does not revisit the emotional debate. There is no ongoing negotiation inside their mind. The decision is not being reevaluated continuously. It has already been finalized through observation over time. And this finalization is what makes the detachment feel so clean. It is not chaotic. It is not reactive. It is resolved. Even if the empath remains physically present in some form of interaction, their emotional availability has already been redirected elsewhere. They are no longer unconsciously investing in potential outcomes. They are no longer emotionally extending trust into uncertainty. Instead, they are operating from a position of completed understanding. The emotional door is not slamming shut. It has already been locked quietly from the inside. This is why the experience of losing an empath can feel confusing for the other person. There is no clear moment that signals the end. No dramatic breakup scene that explains the shift. Instead, there is a gradual realization that emotional access is no longer available. Conversations feel different. Responses feel measured. Engagement feels reduced. Not because effort has decreased, but because emotional presence has withdrawn. At the core of this shift is emotional recalibration. The empath does not continue investing in systems that have repeatedly demonstrated instability. Once trust is compromised enough times, the emotional mind naturally stops projecting safety into that connection. Without perceived safety, emotional investment cannot sustain itself. So it retracts, quietly and completely. And once that retraction is complete, what remains is clarity without attachment. The empath can see the person clearly without emotional distortion. There is no longer confusion about intent, behavior, or patterns. Everything becomes easier to interpret, but also less emotionally significant. Clarity replaces emotional urgency. Understanding replaces emotional dependence. This is also where the empath becomes internally unreachable, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological sense. Attempts to re-enter their emotional space are processed through a system that no longer reacts with openness. Instead, it evaluates consistency against established conclusions. If what is presented does not align with the final internal model, it is filtered out without emotional disruption. The most profound part of this transformation is that it does not require resentment. The empath does not need anger to detach. They do not need hatred or emotional rejection. Detachment happens through understanding, not emotional escalation. Once understanding is complete, emotional engagement naturally dissolves because there is nothing left unresolved that requires investment. At that point, presence and absence begin to feel the same internally. The empath is no longer emotionally influenced by proximity. Whether the person is close or distant, the internal response remains unchanged. This neutrality is often misinterpreted as coldness, but it is actually closure. The emotional system has completed its processing cycle and no longer generates reactive output. And when that state is reached, the connection does not continue in any meaningful emotional form. What once required attention, energy, and emotional participation now exists only as information. Not as something alive in their emotional world, but as something understood and stored, no longer influencing direction, no longer shaping response, no longer holding weight in the present moment.